Welcome to Walking the Way. This is Renovation of the Heart Book Club. We finally made it to chapter 3, and we're going to start at the beginning. Question 1, which is, do you accept the idea that human beings apart from God are ruined? How do you describe that ruin, and what does it mean in practical day-to-day terms? The quote that stood out to me was a bit further in the chapter than the question would imply, but the condition of human life that is characterized by ruin, which is as the result of the ruin of each individual, is one that is best defined by this quote as a constant outpouring of wrongness and wrongdoing that wells up from the malformed human spirit, mind, soul, body, and social context. I think a keen observer of human life would see that as a self-evident reality, that even in their own best intentions, sometimes life just goes sideways. And there's many reasons for that. It could be that the intention that was pursued was done so from ignorance. It wasn't actually good for the person or the situation at hand. So even if an attempt to do a good thing was made, that it was ill-directed or poorly executed. And that's the good side, is someone who wants to do good, just doesn't know how or in what context to do so. And I think, for me, the most obvious example of that sort of ill-formed will to goodness comes from my former marriage. I would characterize my intentions as categorically and completely good towards her. They just weren't received that way by her, and lacking sort of the context or the ability to contextualize good intent versus sort of unpleasant outcomes. It was kind of the wedge that drove between us, and it seems like it was a very small thing that drove us apart, but that just, I think, speaks to the reality of the ruin of our souls and the society in which we live, that something that was, on my view, pretty trivial was able to destroy what should have been a lifelong commitment to one another.
Willard basically sets up this question, like he sort of just asserts at the beginning of the chapter that we must recognize the soul and person in a certain condition. So he just immediately puts it out there that we're ruined. But he goes on to kind of explain this further. So, like, in terms of whether we accept the idea, obviously we agree with Willard that yes, human beings apart from God are ruined. But he explains why that is by quoting C.S. Lewis. And so I'm just going to repeat the quote. In one of C.S. Lewis's more striking passages, he challenges us to remember that the dullest and most uninteresting person you can talk to may one day be a creature which, if you saw it now, you would be strongly tempted to worship, or else a horror and corruption such as you now meet, if at all, only in a nightmare. There are no ordinary people. You have never talked to a mere mortal, and then he goes through talking about how, in the course of history, there's never been someone insignificant. It's just another way of emphasizing that God made us all in his image, and we're all uniquely special in that way, and we're all capable of much more than we could ever imagine. And because of that, the great potential that we have is what makes our current state a state of ruin, because we're so far apart from what we could be. And so part of what's required to recognize that you have a ruined soul is recognizing how far you are from your potential. Like Wes Huff, who's blown up a lot recently for being a Christian apologist, that's gone on the Rogan podcast and done a bunch of different podcasts and talked about the Christian faith. He likes to talk about how in the Old Testament in Isaiah, there's a portion that talks about how God views our good deeds as filthy rags, and the literal translation from the Hebrew is menstrual rags, or it's debated, but it's possible that it's menstrual rags, so it's not just filthy, but like ritually unclean and like very, very gross. And that's kind of the idea that's being expressed here, is particularly non-Christians can come up with this idea of being a good person and feel as though their deeds, even if they aren't pursuing salvation in an eternal sense, they're just pursuing salvation in sort of a life sense. They can feel as though their deeds are saving them and that just doing good is enough. But we need to come to an understanding of how filthy our good deeds are by comparison to God's goodness, and by extension, by comparison to what we could potentially be in our relationship with God. Because when we're united with Him in holiness in heaven, we will look significantly less ruined than we do now, which is sort of what Lewis is getting at in the quote, or at least how I interpret it. I don't know if you have anything to add to that, but I thought that was interesting, that wrapped up in this concept of ruin is the necessity to understand our potential in Christ.
Yeah, and I think that points to Willard's emphasis on vision, where like having that potential goodness, holiness, righteousness in mind is both, like you said, it both convicts us of the present reality in which we exist and its insufficiency, but it also motivates us to pursue that righteousness sort of wholeheartedly, rather than giving ourselves, I guess, permission to be a quote unquote, as you said, a good person and persist under the delusion that that's going to be enough. I've been fond of saying for quite some time that God is much more ambitious than we are, and specifically in the areas of putting sin to death, which I think segues nicely into this conversation of soul ruin, because that's really how that ruin plays out in day-to-day life, is specific acts of sin. And when I say a specific act of sin, everyone that has tried to be good in their entire lives has a thing that they think of when I say that. For guys, a lot of them, it's like sexual stuff, porn, that sort of thing. For women, I have no idea. I'm not a woman, don't know what it's like to be a woman. I'm sure they all have one, because we all do. But that is both the evidence and the means by which souls are ruined. Because an unruined or a complete soul, a healthy one, wouldn't do those specific acts of sin that just would be outside of the realm of their desires, because their desires would be well ordered. But it's also the means, because as we commit sins, we become more ruined. Like the sin itself entrenches our ruination. And we see that in passages like Romans 1, where it talks about being given up to a futile or non-functioning mind because of the acts of sin that we not only persist in, but encourage in others. I'm going to have to agree with Paul here. I can't imagine a more disgusting practice than to actively encourage other people to do things that you know to be ruinous to their entire being. And yet, we do that all the time.
Yep. Willard ties in that concept in Romans, Paul's concept in Romans here in the chapter, which we'll probably get into in a later video, but he talks about subheading on sensuality. He talks about how there's tendency for us to pursue sensual things, and the effect of that is to numb or deaden the senses. And so then that is sort of a never-ending cycle where, having been numbed, you then search for some sort of feeling, and that sort of leads you further into whatever habit of sensual, or he specifically says sensual acts or violent acts are two of the most common. So like whatever sensual or violent act you first committed, you commit a worse one in the cycle to sort of finally feel something, because you're like, it's a never-ending process of kind of chasing the high, or like you're doing the act in the first place to sort of numb yourself, but then having numbed yourself, you want to feel something, and so you do it more, which goes to what your point, Ryan, of how the more you do whatever thing it is, whatever sinful process it is, and the more it just becomes a part of your life, the less you see it and less you recognize it, which is true for all sorts of things. It's not just things that we would necessarily think of when we first think sin. Like, just like that's true of lying, like just living your life in such a way that you omit truths or tell half-truths, or like omitting truths and then telling half-truths and then telling white lies, and then like all of a sudden you're just living a lie where it's easy for you to just distort reality in your own mind. So you may even feel as if you're living your life relatively truthfully, but you're presenting yourself to the world in a way that's completely separate from or even to yourself. You're thinking of yourself in a way that's completely separate from the reality of who you are, which I think is especially true of non-Christians, and can go back to the concept of sort of, doing good things and doing bad things, and just sort of a general sense of, oh, I'm a good person. But that largely requires a willful ignorance of who you are as a person and the necessity to worship the God that created you, because we all have within us a drive to be united with God because we were created in his image. And so you have to deaden that and ignore that and lie to yourself about that in order to be living a life where you're content with just being a good person, as the modern person would see it.
To sort of tie things together in a practical way, consider the ways in which your soul has been ruined and the ways in which you have cooperated in that ruin. And if you can't come up with anything, just ask around.
Thank you for watching today's episode of Walking the Way Book Club. Please like, comment, and share this video, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more content. We can't wait to see you in the next one. God bless.